Symposium Day, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to ask a couple folks to come off their break and join us as we move into the next conversation. And this one is incredibly special. You know, as some of our panelists, I see Ryan has joined us. Hi, Ryan. Marcus is on. Hello. Chavis is on. Paulette is also on. Tamara, I see you. Please come on off your black boxes so that we can all get started with our conversation. Before we do our introductions, I do just want to share a little bit about the social justice focus of the Black Alumni Collective in its entirety. Now, because we are Black alumni leaders, social justice is infused in who we are and the work that we do inherently. And so I'm going to share my screen just fairly briefly and share with you the 6 pillars of impact that drive our work within the Black Alumni Collective. I see that Sanders is on. He's one of our fellow board members and also one of the key architects of how the collective came together. So many thanks, Sanders, for joining us. Ali, I hope you're on as well. Many thanks to you for your incredible work. So 6 pillars of impact. I will read them out loud for those who don't have access to their screen. Number 1, advocate for inclusion. Number 2, encourage student recruitment. Number 3, support philanthropy. Number 4, broaden community service. Number 5, promote leadership. And number 6, celebrate our universities. Now, we hope, family, that you see your work within these 6 pillars because these were created by the Black alumni leaders that put together the Black Alumni Collective in the first place. So we always want to hold true to those elements of our work. Now, this conversation today virtually is part 1 of 2. Today, we're going to take a deep dive with the specialists and the experts that you see on your screens. We're going to learn about some of the social justice priorities, not just for our country, but for Black students, Black families, and Black communities in particular. Social justice has always been threaded through our work. Many of you know that we collaborate quite often with Black Voters Matter. In each of our conferences, we aim to connect with the local affiliate there. I think in 2020, that's when we had a significant focus on voter registration in partnership with Florida State University. Last year at Duke University, we partnered around economic empowerment and development of Black families and communities. So that was a focus in Durham. And this year, you know, we've got a lot of legal stuff happening in our world. And so the experts that you see before you are prepared to take us through a journey. We're going to ask for folks to sort of do a round robin of introducing themselves. And we're going to ask them to introduce themselves in this way. Please tell us a little bit about your work in social justice with a focus on your work in racial justice. Ryan, we'll get started with you. Then we're going to pivot to Paulette, then Marcus, then Tamara, and then Chavis. So Ryan, go ahead and kick us off.
Thanks, Allyson. So wonderful to be with you all. And thanks for working through the technical difficulties. It's an interesting metaphor for, I think, our existence as Black folks in this country. It's never been a straight, linear path. And that's really what inspired my journey as a civil rights lawyer. I started off practicing 20 years ago. I began my career as a lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, founded by the first, and some argued only, Black Supreme Court justice until Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson took to the court. And I spent a bunch of years there doing national level civil rights litigation impact cases mostly across American South. And then 7 years ago came to focus that attention on the state of New Jersey at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, doing similar work around public education, community research, and writing, public policy analysis, and litigation under the leadership of our board chair, Paulette Brown. So good to be here with you all. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Hi, Paulette.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for this opportunity. And I wish I could see everyone who's present and listening. But I'm Paulette Brown, and I work currently a lot with Ryan with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where I am the chair of the board, as Ryan mentioned. But my journey started a really long time ago. It started probably when I was in the 10th grade, and it was the first time that I had ever gone to a school that was not segregated. And so there were a number of racial justice issues in which I became involved. And then I went to Howard undergraduate school, where, you know, that was upfront, close and personal. And then the shock of going to law school, and there were only 4 Black people in my law school class. So it was, and so my journey has continued from them. I've been involved with a number of different organizations, although I have worked sort of in a different kind of structure other than Ryan. I have always participated and been involved with a lot of different social, racial justice issues. When I was president of the American Bar Association, I had a 360 commission that dealt specifically with these types of issues and had about 9 policies adopted by the American Bar Association related to justice issues.
Thank you, Paulette. Always good to have somebody from Howard on the line. Really appreciate your leadership in the field and around the country. Marcus, let's hear from you.
Sure, that's gonna be a hard one to follow up. But yeah, my name's Marcus McDonald. I'm the lead organizer of Charleston Black Lives Matter. So I got into this work about 3 years ago. Started working with the chapter. We got it back together. It was disbanded for a few years. So we got it back together in the midst of everything that was going on. Got to work doing a lot of stuff locally in some of the city of Charleston area and the county level. And we had our original base at Eastside Community Center. So that's where we did a lot of our work. We had an internet, a learning hub there. So if y'all remember around the pandemic, kids could either do the work at home or at school. So we had a hub for kids to do the work there. They got tutoring and sorry, stuff going on in the background. But I don't know, that just kind of started my work, just working with the youth. I was a substitute teacher for a couple of years during that time. And yeah, we just done a lot of work right now. A lot of my work focuses around stuff going on at the State House, focusing on what they're trying to do with our public education system. And we'll talk about it later because I know it's a question, but as far as the censorship and the book bans that's been going on across our state and across the country, but specifically across our state that I feel like sometimes go under the radar. So that's been a big focus of my work, working with students, college, K through 12, et cetera. So glad to be here and be in work.
And we are glad to have you here, Marcus. I am also from South Carolina, and indeed, the work is heavy and layered, but we're so glad to have incredible leaders like you and Tamara, who I'll ask to introduce herself, who are, really leading a significant movement. Hey, Tamara.
Hi, how are y'all doing this morning or afternoon? I'm Dr. Tamara Butler, the Executive Director of the Avery Research Center. I also serve as the Associate Dean of Community Engagement and Strategic Planning. My work started way before I got this job, but I used to be, before taking on this job, I was an African American Studies professor, as well as a professor of English education at Michigan State. For 6 years prior to that, I worked with teachers in Columbus, Ohio, to help them think about social justice, civic engagement. Recently published a book called Where's the Justice? Engage Pedagogies in schools and communities. So that's where some of my work is. And then also just thinking about racial and social justice in the work that I do with students, whether it's advising a student organization or it's in my work and thinking about summer programs and getting students thinking about civics, thinking about their rights, thinking about the struggle and the triumphs and the questions that we have around civil rights and justice. And so I'm very excited about today's conversation because the other part is that here at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, we also have a race and social justice initiative that predates me, but most of the programming and outreach in that work focuses on students. We focus on community members and thinking about engagement around issues related to racism and social justice.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Butler. Now, Dr. Butler didn't mention something. She's got a sweatshirt on that represents Xavier University of Louisiana. Come on, President Verrett. So I had the chance to work with Xavier quite a few years ago, and he gave me something that continues to follow me and nurture me to this day. He said that higher education is one of the key tools of social mobility for Black people. And that's one of the things that faculty members, alums, staff, and community members really live out loud at Xavier. So Dr. Butler, thank you so much for representing so many incredible universities. We really appreciate your leadership. We're going to pivot now to Chavis. Hey, Chavis, what's going on?
Hello, how are you all? My name is Chavis Jones. I currently serve as Associate Counsel at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law at our national office in Washington, D.C. It's an organization that was founded at the very peak of the Civil Rights Movement in 1963. It was founded by John F. Kennedy at the East Wing of the White House. He invited 244 lawyers together to ensure that the movement was not only happening in the streets, but that it was happening in the courts. And so I'm proud to work there and work on national, federal and state cases all over the country. And I've been working there for just over a year. And I would say that my social justice orientation began at Morehouse College. I'm a graduate of Morehouse under extraordinary leadership under the long shadow of folks like MLK and the very foundation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so we were kind of engulfed in a world of social justice. And there was a lot of turmoil happening in our country, the death of Trayvon Martin and so many others that kind of colored my experience as an undergraduate. And then I went to Harvard for graduate school prior to going to law school at Duke. And while there, myself and some others went to Ferguson, Missouri during the weekend of the funeral of Michael Brown. And there we participated and helped citizens there in the community. We participated in marches and protests. And I saw firsthand someone that was of similar age. And I wanted to do something to change the material existences of Black folks. And so to be a part of that work and then to go to law school following that under the guise of a Trump presidency has truly animated the work that I do to want to ensure that communities are more just and more equitable for all. And I have this belief that the people closest to the problem should be those closest to the solutions. And so I spend a lot of time in community with folks trying to hear stories and trying to make sure that my work lines up with the stories and narratives of people who experience the most pain.
All right, thank you so much for rounding us up for our introduction. So let's get right into it, family. So one of the key things that, alumni lead with, right? We talk about alumni leadership is the impact that we're able to have on the experiences specifically of Black students on campus. So our first question, really relates to, how Black alumni associations support and advise students as they take on critical issues on their campuses and throughout their communities. So does anyone want to take us in a deep dive around what that influence ought to look like from your perspective as social justice leaders? Nobody wants to dive in. I think Tamara just pulled herself off mute. We'll hear from her.
Sure. So I was just going to speak on the idea of Black alumni associations, really building relationships in terms of building mentoring networks, because I think so often students, there's a generational divide usually, and folks are like, well, back in my day, we did that. And it's like, that's cool. But as a result, there's also a dismissing of the ways that young people and current students are organizing and approaching activism. And I think it's deeply unfair for us to kind of like turn away from each other's experiences and each other's approaches. And so as alumni, I think we have an opportunity to say, well, this is what we tried, right? How can we support what you're doing? Should we show up to your sit-ins? Can we actually do something besides sit here? Can we turn those into teach-ins and really talk about, what was my experience as a student? What's my current experience and work in justice work? I think those are usually some of the stronger kind of conversations, because it also helps see that there's a trajectory, right? That there's at least a through line for some students, that your experiences are not completely new. And so I want to share like, oh, well, we did a sit-in, but we probably should have did the sit-in at this place. We worked with this staff member in order to bring different things to our attention, but also bringing in people who have a certain level of expertise. I think is also really helpful during these kind of sit-ins, turning them into teach-ins, showing up to meetings and being supportive and really hearing each other out. So that's usually my thoughts.
Excellent. And Dr. Butler, can you talk a little bit about the marriage of research, right? I know that you lead some significant work at the Avery Center. Can you talk about just the role of, what academic research looks like when it's housed at a university, and how Black alumni can be a little bit more supportive of how we integrate that, especially when it comes to academic curriculum?
Sure. So at the Avery Research Center, we are an archive, a museum, and a library. And so most folks are like, well, what kind of research are y'all doing? I'm like, we're not like the Pew Center. We actually are just a space where people can come in and engage in that kind of work. We hold a lot of archives that look at civil rights. that look at slavery and post-slavery emancipation reconstruction period. And so thinking about how you can take that into consideration for faculty, we really encourage them to come in and introduce the archives to our students, introduce the space to students. I think on campuses, every campus usually has an archive. And I think it's really important to kind of figure out like, well, where are the Black people in your archive? Where they show up on your campus? I think at Michigan State, I was excited to find out about like the first Black woman graduate, right? But she's kind of like hidden in this photograph where people like, I think that's her, I'm not sure, but showing that there's a presence. And so on campuses, it's drawing in faculty who that's usually their background. There are some folks who study Black campus movements. Have you actually talked to those folks? Thinking about resources, special collections, have a lot of things. And so all of those things are curriculum, but also other things that function as curriculum are also people. So we're really big at Avery, for example, because we were a school at one point, that sometimes our alum come by. And when we have College of Charleston students working in the archives, and then an alumni of this school that closes in 54 stop by and they're like, oh snap, I just went through your papers. And so thinking about living history and curriculum as well. So being able to merge the data that you see on paper, the pieces in the archives, merging that with the kind of like everyday experiences, really helps people think about theory in action. So kind of like a praxis, as we like to use that word a lot in education, is really helpful, and it gives students a kind of lens in order to approach the work.
Indeed. And so for everybody on the call, if you have a center of research, it's just not a place to hold an event, right? It's a body of work that has been built over decades, especially if it focuses on Black excellence. Now, Ryan, I want to kind of pivot to you for just a second. Not only are you, this incredible leader, in the social justice space. I know that you're president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, but you're also a proud alum. I think I saw that you're a trustee and vice chair of the Board of Colorado College. Can you tell us a little bit about how your experience in social justice influences your perspectives in the work that you lead with different institutions of higher ed?
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, it really builds on what Tamara shared. Being on the board, I've been really humbled by the way in which young folks, current students, are leading the fight very similar to the one that I was a part of when I was there. And when I was a student there, I did not appreciate that there was a broader body of support from graduates. And so to your question, I think what's really important for students is that they feel supported by graduates who support the struggle that they have. And the struggle may be similar, the methods may be different, but to have support from, in my case, someone on the board, from an alumni association, I think is really powerful. What's interesting is that I'll share this, in our last board meeting, we had a student trustee who I spoke to before the board meeting, who said, I want to do something. But it may be disruptive to the board meeting. Is that okay? And I said, you should do what you feel led to do and not ask for permission. And he said, bet. And so the board meeting proceeded, and he and some students came into the board meeting and essentially said, we understand you have an agenda, but we have the floor now. And they expressed some issues they had around some of the things that the college wasn't doing in their minds. And it was a powerful moment. And it was a reminder for a number of the trustees that when we were at the college, in my case, 25 years ago, we had similar issues. And I think what happens is when you're in college, right, it's when you're probably most progressive, to be honest. And then as you get older, not us in the line, but folks mostly off the line, when you get older, you have entanglements. You get, maybe you get a mortgage, maybe you have a car payment, right? Maybe you have kids who are in college, and the way in which you saw the world as a student, free from a lot of the entanglements, is now constrained by the reality of those entanglements. So what I think alumni are charged with is being supportive of students. It's empowering them with support, not that they're asking us for it, but it's available to them, to protest, to lift their voices, to advocate in ways that they think is required by the moment. And not so much in the way that folks later in life who are entangled think is the appropriate expression of their frustration. So I'm really inspired by the current moment. I think that, it's not surprising that we've seen, particularly given the changing demographics in our world. New Jersey, for example, where Paulette and I are, will soon be a majority people of color state. This is consistent with the broader demographics. And we've seen years ago when I was in high school, Public Enemy, which was then a pioneering group, came out with this classic CD called Fear of a Black Planet. And the cover was of planet Earth. And there was a black planet that would soon eclipse the Earth. And there would be this corresponding fear that would attach to the darkening, the browning, the blackening of this planet. And we've seen that happen in the last 10 years, and especially now. And I think a lot of what's happening around trying to suppress the truth around who we are, our history, is connected to the reality that we are becoming a majority people of color nation, which means there's an opportunity to bring in new voices to the political fold. But that can't happen. It's never happened without a corresponding effort to constrain those voices.
I wanted to speak really quickly to this question because my role on the Duke Black Alumni Association came about as a direct result of Sanders Adu, who was the Duke Black Alumni president at the time, pulling me aside as a student leader following a meeting with the president of the university and saying, Chavis, you should be a part of our board. And so we have this council at Duke called the President's Council on Black Affairs. And often students and faculty and alumni come and we speak with the president about issues that are germane to the institution as it relates to Black affairs. And so being there representing Black graduate and professional students as the president of our organization, I met Sanders very early on. I met other alumni very early on. And one week after a meeting, he just simply pulled me aside while he was there on campus and said, hey, join us. And I think that's one of the things that alumni can do across campuses is just really look for the voices that are emerging from the students and pull them aside and say, hey, would you like to serve? And that's how you ensure the posterity of your organizations moves forward. So I really appreciate Sanders, who has been a great help to me as I transitioned to DC, connecting me with other alumni, and who continues to be a great alumni leader across the board.
Indeed. It's always wonderful to recognize the significant impact that others have had. So we're going to pivot slightly and talk a little bit about racial reckoning, that we've been dealing with our entire lives, but that really came to the surface in 2020. And we'll ask all of our panelists to chime in here. We'll get started with Paulette. So just really want to kind of dive in here. All of you are members of and lead different organizational boards, right? And so when it comes to how boards have responded to the racial reckoning moments of 2020 and beyond, including the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the civil unrest that happened afterwards, how have organizational boards that you're a part of, whether it's university boards or social justice organization boards, what was the reaction of boards in your experience over the past couple of years? Let's start with Paulette.
So thank you for that question. And I think that it ties into what Tamara was talking about, what Chavis was talking about, what Ryan was talking about. And so with the boards that I have been on, and I say that in the context of it is wonderful to have these Black alumni associations, but it's also important to have for Black alumni associations to encourage students not to just belong to Black, that you've got to belong to other things as well, so that you can have a voice and have input into the bigger decisions that are being made. So that when you're on a board, you can ensure that their reaction to racial injustice is not simply performative. That you have to make sure that there is some direct action. And so I'm not just on the board of the Institute for Social Racial Justice. I'm also on the board of a community trust foundation. And as a result of being on that pretty white board, I was able to direct their giving focus to racial justice issues, like to the Institute. And so I think that it's important for us to encourage our younger people, our people in college, and including encourage ourselves, don't isolate ourselves from other organizations, because if we do, then we won't have a say in what is actually done. People have to go beyond mere statements and to define what the actual action will be. So I was at a law firm when a lot of this first kicked off. And so what I talked to the chair of my firm about is we can't simply make a statement. We can't simply just give money to the Legal Defense Fund or to the Equal Justice Fund. What are we going to do to really put our money where our mouth is? And so it's not so that, you know, we have to be careful about just issuing statements and just throwing money at things. We have to make sure that there are actionable items that are taken with regard to these issues. And I think that that's what we should be encouraging our students to do, you know, to look outside of, yes, we must belong to the Black Alumni Association. First and foremost, we must do that. But we also have to look and see where else we can, where else we can be, where voice is necessary.
Excellent. And we really want to lift that up, Paulette. Thank you for that incredible wisdom. We'll now go to Tamara to answer the same question. You know, what do organizational boards, what have they done in the past couple of years that you'd like to share with us in terms of inspiring great work in social justice?
So I'm on a lot of, yeah, that's how I feel. I'm on the board for Coastal Conservation League, not to be confused with a Coastal Conservative League, not the same. Coastal Conservation League. I'm on the board for the International African American Museum. I'm on the advisory board for the Gibbs Museum of Art, and I feel like that might be it for now. But I think one of the things that I am appreciative of some of the boards is their effort in trying to figure out that race and racial and this kind of social unrest is not equivalent to DEI. So that's because I think that there's a lot of that. It's like, oh, we just need to hire more Black people, right? Or we need to hire more brown people, or we need to hire more people from the LGBTQ community. And I was like, it's partially that, but it's also about having a real long conversation about how your institution itself perpetuates racism, classism, and other forms of discrimination. And so it's been really great to watch board members try to have these conversations. So getting them to experts who actually do DEI work, but giving them the tools to understand the language. So right now I've been enjoying, I did a workshop, for example, with a colleague who's in art education. And so it was virtual to bring different art institutions together and have people think about like, oh, well, we're in Charleston, but this organization is in Phoenix. We have very different demographics of people we serve. And so figuring out, especially a place like Charleston, everything feels very black and white. And I was like, I don't think that, I was like, there's a whole lot of people in between that we're leaving out. And so to be able to watch board members say, oh, now I understand microaggressions and how, whether or not I admit I see it, I'm actually perpetuating that, or I'm engaging, or I'm committing a microaggression in all these different ways. So that was, for me, I thought that was powerful, that people were actually trying to get the language right and also shifting their mindset. Because I think a lot of people are offering DEI trainings, but to watch boards in particular start to own, like, how is my institution engaged and invested in racism? I'm on an advisory board with the medical university, where they are trying to figure out what to do with human remains that are in their archives, right? And it's like, how do we bury them? What is the ethical way of like repatriating or rematriating these remains? So those are things where I think it's good to be on a board. I also just like to sometimes be a fly on the wall and say, if the Black person in the room doesn't speak, are y'all gonna figure this out? Right. So that's the other thing, is trying to hold people to the fire, because they will turn to you and be like, well, what are your thoughts? Nope. I'm just here to listen. So I hope y'all can figure it out without me. So for me, I think I've been really watching and hoping that people will become more proactive in this, and really thinking about, okay, great. Now we have all the tools we need. We can get ahead of whatever comes down the pipeline in the upcoming years.
Thanks for that, Dr. Butler. Hey, Ryan, can we pivot on over to you for any insight that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the sort of a bridge between Paulette and Tamara. You know, I was thinking about just what we've experienced in the last 3 years, you know, in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the leading cause of death of Black people in New Jersey in 2020 was COVID. So there was just this incredibly painful period for Black people, not just here, but across the country. And like you all, I was on, all these, so many, really an overwhelming number of Zoom calls, which typically began with loss, right? So there was COVID, and there was the George Floyd moment. And the conversations were really around sort of how do we stop the harm attendant to Black people, either because of COVID or police brutality or structural racism more broadly. And I remember in one of those calls, I just sort of shifted the gears and said, how do we transition our thinking from sort of stopping harm to thinking affirmatively, to Tamara's point about, so what do we need to create a situation where Black people can win? Like, what might it look like for us to exist in a world where we win? And to be honest, the folks in that call were stumped, because our orientation is so often geared towards stopping harm. And I'm 46. So for me, like, this George Floyd image behind me, in the center of it is Rodney King. And that was March 3rd, 1991. And you all who are alive, and remember that the thinking back then was, if we could just record the brutality and get some accountability, we could stop it, right? And 30 years later, having a very similar conversation that is ongoing, most recently with Tyree Nichols, and promises to continue. So on that call, I started thinking about, what if we led with an affirmative strategy around what it would take for us, not just to reduce the harm, right? Because that's not flourishing, but how might Black people really, really win? And so I've been thinking a lot about that. Part of what we're seeing happening in places like Florida and beyond, the attack on the truth, I think, is intended to keep us in the deficit space. But if we led with an affirmative strategy around, here is what it looks like for us to win, I think an affirmative strategy would help us to overcome some of the resistance. And I'll say this really quickly. I see Sharon Stroy on the line. She is at Rutgers, and we've been working with her and folks at Rutgers around truth, reconciliation, healing, and transformation. And part of that conversation is around reparations, right? Because reparations, that conversation is rooted in the truth, right? The reality is that we all stand on this foundation that's cracked, and those cracks were built into our foundation by slavery. And today we live with the vestiges of and the shadow of slavery, but we don't often situate that conversation in that history and its modern day impact. And I think that's part of what's necessary for our affirmative vision for what it means for Black folks to win.
Indeed. And Chavis, before we come to you, two things that you said, Ryan. What does it take for Black folks to win? Like, how do we move from this mindset of scarcity and Black pain to a place where we're all winning? And I think, as many collaborations as we can foster, as many partnerships as we can build, that's got to be the focus. How are we going to win, right? And then the second thing that you notice, and I know Sharon is such a truth teller. I don't know what y'all are doing in Jersey, but you're doing it right. How do we start people telling the truth? How do we start them about, when we have conversations about colonization and anti-Blackness, how do we orient that in a conversation about truth? And so I just wanted to give a shout out again to Sharon, who's leading some really great work at Rutgers. Ryan, I hope you're going to be with us next year. Because it's going to be a phenomenal conversation and dialogue. But I just wanted to lift up those two ideas. Thank you so much, Ryan. Chavis, let's hear from you, and then Marcus will hear from you.
Yes, really quickly. When I graduated from law school in May of 2020, I was looking forward to, wasn't looking forward to it, but I was looking forward to the bar prep and everything else. And on May 25th, George Floyd was killed. My birthday was May 26th, so I'll always remember kind of the tension that existed between that, thinking about those 9 minutes in which he lay there crying out for help, crying out for his mother, and wondering how the world would respond to that moment, but particularly how the institutions that were led by folks who didn't look like me would respond. And I was really pleased that in a very, very short turnaround, the president of Duke University convened the group, the President's Council on Black Affairs, to come together for a virtual call to discuss what the institution's response would be to that moment. And a lot of great work that Sanders will discuss in person came out of that. That was tangible work around anti-racism. And we used language and we really implored the president to think critically about how this moment could resituate the institution, an institution that is already in the South and has particular baggage around being a Southern institution that is a particularly elite institution, but we know about the vestiges of enslavement and Jim Crow that kind of are harbored in places like North Carolina. And so to have that moment where he knew that he could lean on the Black alumni, and moments that have happened subsequent to that where students have experienced bouts of racism and the like, and he's immediately called upon us virtually to speak, has been incredible. And I think that that's why the relationship has to be forged between alumni associations and their respective presidents to ensure that moments like this are not lost, because we recognize that while the rest of us were starting to wear masks, as Ryan indicated during COVID-19, racism was being unmasked. And we have to ensure that on campuses across America, students who walk those campuses are able to know that they are safe, that they are cared for, and that their campus environment actually embraces their full identity as Black students or whatever their identities may be. So really critical moment in 2020 and thereafter. And I think it presents an opportunity for us now, knowing the institutions still care about these issues, to really mobilize and leverage our collective genius to move institutions towards the ideals that we look for our educational institutions to kind of embody in America.
Indeed, there's a level of accountability, right, that you're talking about, Chavis, that hopefully movements like this and conversations like the one we're having today can really help to enhance and strengthen. Marcus, let's pivot over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll keep mine brief because I've probably been on the least amount of boards. I'm probably the youngest on the panel as well. I'm 26. I also didn't mention I'm a graduate of College Charleston. So I'll speak on my experiences on the board, but also like in employment, because I know a lot of people go through that, trying to figure out if they can use their voice just in their regular job. Like, and when I was getting out of college, I had a finance job because that was my major, and I felt really, and that's when around the George Floyd and everything was happening, and I felt very, insecure about being out there and being in the field and being on the front line, and I kind of feel that insecurity in the office. So, and I don't recommend this as a solution for everybody, but when I felt that it was going to get to that level that I felt like I just didn't feel comfortable, I left. And, I made a conscious decision, to save up and whatnot. But that was my, experience in the employment. I know not everybody's blessed enough to just be able to leave, but that's how I felt in that moment. And then on boards, I was part of a neighborhood board. And I feel like what I brought to that really through these moments, and also, from my generational perspective, I really was kind of the champion of let these kids enjoy their moments, especially the kids who've been in the pandemic held up. A lot of kids were having parties and just enjoying their life. And there'd be some people on neighborhood boards be like, oh, with this hip hop music or whatever. And that's a part of, Black joy too. Like us Black kids, we want to have fun too. We want to throw parties, etc. And throw art shows and what have you. So kind of being that voice of because a lot of people who are on these neighborhood boards are a lot older, even if it is an all Black board, a lot of them are over a certain age. So oftentimes I try to just shake it up and be like, listen, you might have seen a lot of change, but as you've seen, a lot of things haven't changed. And usually the brunt of a lot of these police brutality attacks and just a lot of this aggression and even poverty is young Black folks dealing with it. So making sure that that's also centered anytime they have me on the board is what I usually try to do.
Thank you for that. And we appreciate, the summary of your experiences, and you're never too young to be an activist. And you are proof of that, Marcus. So thank you. Let's pivot now to some themes just that are emerging in the United States around anti-Blackness, right? This, covers several social justice issues, whether it's the war on critical race theory, systemic racism, or what it looks like, in areas of, the United States, including Florida, Texas, and other areas. There's this movement to ban Blackness, whether it's books, education, or classes. And so my question, and we can start with Paulette, if that's okay. Just want to know, how do you feel about this movement, and what guidance do you have for Black alumni leaders who are on the call today, who can, bring their universities along with them in shifting this gear? So Paulette, can we get started with you?
So I got a chill as you started talking about that, because it's happening so rapidly and it's spreading from state to state. Jerry Harris, who asked some of us to be on this program, sent an article about the University of North Carolina last night, and how they are now wanting to remove, do not ask people about what their DEI experience is. Do not ask people about their commitment to DEI. That cannot be a part of any interview process, and also through other permeations throughout the university structure. And so I think that, in a situation like the University of South Carolina, I think that other surrounding schools, private schools, for example, like Duke, I think that their Black Alumni Association should make sure that they coalesce with the University of North Carolina Black Alumni Association to provide that support, that allyship. And when you have that kind of numbers and that kind of strength and that type of gravitas that Duke might bring, that might help, sort of maybe stop the train. But it is a train, I think, that is running out of control right now. And I think that the more DeSantis, for example, says this is where woke goes to die, I think we have to be even more woke. And I think that, there's a tremendous amount of education that has to be done to educate. I understand the students have to be focused on, getting their education. I know I told my son 4 years or graduation, whichever one comes first, that's all I'm paying for. But I think that when we also have to be advocates, and we also have to be willing to take some risk, like people who before us took risks. The people before us took risks so that we could be sitting here talking about this right now. And Marcus, I understand what you're talking about, because people think that because I was in a big firm, I made a lot of money. I didn't make a lot of money. I've always lived below my means because I never want my voice to be silenced. And I think that sometimes, and I'm not saying that it's for everybody, but I do think that, we have a responsibility and a duty to all of those students, and to have them to understand that, yes, they are in school to learn, and to get their education so that they can too advocate. But there's also a responsibility to look at what's going on at your school and not sit idly by and let it happen. And I think that Black alums can provide the necessary support for those students so that they won't have to face these challenges alone. I think Black alumni have a real strong role in this process. And I think that if you take North Carolina again, for an example, there are a lot of schools under that university system that they have been really chipping away at a lot of things. This is not the first thing that's happened in the University of North Carolina system. And so, but I think that we can't isolate ourselves and say, oh, that's the University of North Carolina. No, where are the other private schools, including HBCU schools, that can lend support and engage in real advocacy to let them know that we are not standing idly by and letting this happen.
Thank you for that, Paulette. Let's pivot on over to Ryan.
Yeah, no, I love the question and Paulette's response. I have Selma, Alabama on my mind, in part because Paulette, Jerry, and I will travel there next week for the commemoration of the Voting Rights Act on Bloody Sunday. And I know Chavis, your director, is bringing a team of folks in the Lawyers Committee, Damon Hewitt. So I have it in my mind, in part because your question, Allyson, made me think of going back to 1964. I wasn't alive then, but I read about it. When right after the Civil Rights, right after the Civil Rights Act was passed, there's this famous story about how Dr. King then goes to President Johnson and he says, listen, I appreciate the Civil Rights Act that is designed to integrate public spaces, but what the country really needs is a federal voting rights bill. And in this really incredible conversation, President Johnson says back to Dr. King, look, I appreciate that you want that, but in 1964, President Johnson says to Dr. King, but the country is suffering from, quote, civil rights fatigue. 1964, and then President Johnson goes on to say to Dr. King, if what you want is a federal voting rights bill, you're gonna have to make me do it. And then Dr. King and John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and others say, bet, we'll do that. And that is Bloody Sunday. That was their fight to make this country create a federal voting rights act. And you all know the story. Within one generation, the Voting Rights Act transforms America, its state legislatures, and culminates in part in the election of a Black president. And then 10 years ago, the Supreme Court tore out the heart of the thing that made it possible to have a Black president, ushering us into a period that we're in now and restoring in a November election in 2016, white supremacy to the White House. And I do think I think Paulette's point is well taken, that what this moment requires is that we acknowledge that we're in a fight and that we fight. And I do think one of the challenges I see, I think about the rise of social media and the way that it's able to connect us instantly. But I think too often the orientation is as a spectator. Did you see what happened here or there? Can you believe these folks are doing this or that? Oh my gosh. And we share all of that that's happening, but there's not a corresponding, and here's what I am doing ahead of or in response to that. So I think the orientation around the fight is what's essential for us. So these attacks are not new. They have been baked into who this country is, particularly as Black folks are poised to exercise their power. And I think we have to exercise our power, less as spectators about what's happening and more about what's happening. So for the alumni of these colleges and universities that Paulette talked about where these attacks are happening, what are those Black alumni associations doing to organize to resist those, to overcome those? Right? Not just spectating and sharing about what's happening, but really thinking about how do we beat back, like our Selma moment, how do we beat back what's happening?
It's the fear of the Black planet.
Every time.
Indeed. So thank you so much, Ryan and Paulette. Yeah, it's the fear of the Black planet and the Black future and the Black promise. So, mobilizing and moving together, I think is one really, key part of how we overcome and how we continue to lead with strength and resilience. So thank you for that, Ryan. Let's pivot now to Tamara, and then Chavis, then Marcus, and then Toschia.
So I think there's like two things. I think one of the things is there's a way to strategically use numbers, and two types of numbers. So one is how many Black students, or any students, but Black in particular, are enrolled in the courses that we're talking about. So taking out a DEI strategy, taking out the DEI requirement for faculty applications, for student applications, is going to be key in being like, well, how do you then uncover a faculty member, for example's positionality? How do you uncover the things that they're actually committed to? So if we know that there's a faculty member that's doing like really transformative things in their classrooms, well, if nobody's enrolled in their class, then basically all that goes out the window, right? Like nobody cares. Nobody's going to invest in a thing. I look specifically at like the College of Charleston, and we have an African American Studies program, right? That program is taught by a lot of different professors, but there's really only 2 professors inside the program itself. So what does it mean to then like flood those classes with students, right? If we want something to stay, we got to show that it has staying power. The kinds of students who are enrolling, are they looking for more classes? Are they connected to women and gender studies classes? Are they connected to international studies? So that's one set of numbers, is like, if we're going to say that we're saying that the ban on books and the teaching of Black history doesn't matter if those classes don't fill, right? If those classes aren't making, they can easily get snatched right off the books and disappear. The other set of numbers is money. So often folks are like, well, we'll just tell the university, that's cool. You're not $1 million donor. I don't have to listen to you, right? So, but if you are putting your money behind the initiatives that the university thinks it wants to get rid of, they have no choice but to keep it. So at the College of Charleston, we have the Legacy Scholars, right? 1967 Legacy Scholars, that's when the first set of African-American students are enrolling and graduating through the system. Who's funding that? because that can easily get snatched right on off the table if there's no funding and support of that. And so as alum, so often people get drafted to be on board of trustees and other kinds of boards and sit on initiatives and advisory councils. But we also know universities talk money, because they're, at the end of the day, they're all businesses. That's how they function. That's how they work. And so if we want to, one of the things that we can think about mobilizing is making sure that classes are filled with the students that of the initiatives and ideas that we really want to see pushed forward. And the other part is, well, cool. So y'all not gonna fund it? We'll just take that donation from my whatever and we're gonna put it someplace else. Because we want people to listen to us and take us seriously, but they have no reason to do that when you have someone on the other side of the aisle or someone on the other side of the ideology who's going to funnel the money in to the initiative that keeps DEI off the books. So just saying, if we can also think about like capital, that kind of money, and thinking about students as that also that kind of like numbers, I think that helps us in this kind of fight against the erasure of Black people and Blackness.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Butler. I want to pivot just slightly and kind of, create a conversation, and we've chatted about this before, around affirmative action, right? I know all of you are in the trenches when it comes to the Supreme Court conversation that's happening right now about affirmative action. Chavis, I know that you've done a lot of work professionally in this space. And if you can sort of give us the background on what that's looking like and what you believe our role ought to be as Black alumni leaders, that would be really, really helpful. So Chavis, we'll hear from you.
Absolutely. When I think about all of these issues together, I'm reminded of a quote from James Baldwin, who said that we must tell the truth until we can no longer bear it. And I'm also reminded of another quote that says that those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it. And so in this moment where there are attacks on affirmative action, there are two cases at the US Supreme Court that took place in October, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina. And in those two cases, there are attacks from an organization called Students for Fair Admissions on the race-conscious admissions policies of a private institution in Harvard and a public institution at the University of North Carolina. This has vast and far-reaching consequences for institutions of higher education all over the country. It is perhaps one of the most important cases in the education space to come before the courts in the last decade or more, if not longer, especially given the composition of the court as it stands. And so I hope that individuals are staying apprised of this particular instance, but I also hope that individuals across these alumni associations are going to the presidents and the administrators at their institutions and saying, what are your plans? I'm sure you're aware of these cases. What are your plans to ensure that these campuses remain diverse, irrespective of the outcomes of what happens at the Supreme Court? How are you mobilizing your alumni associations to have those conversations and to ensure that they're being deeply imaginative around these issues? And so it's a really consequential moment in which we all have to take a vested interest. And going back to the question about critical race theory and diversity interests and things of that sort, I think that we emerged from a people out of the Mississippi freedom struggle who created freedom schools and who taught themselves these issues. And so if students are not learning about African-American studies and critical race theory, I think it's really incumbent upon us to ensure that we create spaces where they can learn those things outside of the auspices of the classroom. And so these issues are linked inextricably. The erasure of history and the erasure of Black bodies on the campuses of these institutions. And we have to take a really, really important role in ensuring that neither of those things take place.
Indeed, thank you. Can we pop on over to Paulette for your influential ideas on this?
So I'll be brief. I think that first of all, we should work under the presumption that there will be no more affirmative, quote unquote, affirmative action in admissions policies. And so with that, I think that, I think that schools should have already started looking at this. And I know that some schools have already started looking at this to counter and to determine what else can be done. Damon actually testified at the oral arguments in one of the cases, but from the lawyers committee. But I think, I agree with Chavis is that we have to, as or Black alumni associations, and even people who went to HBCU schools and maybe went to graduate schools, we have to really get ahead of this, and we have to go in sort of en masse as an organization, and we have to not just ask them what they're going to do, we have to offer up some ideas and suggestions so that they won't be wandering around in the forest. I think that we have to go in with a plan, and tell them, give them suggestions so that they won't have to think about it from whole cloth.
Indeed, that connection is really, really, really important. So thank you, Paulette, for raising that up. Let's hear, I think we have another special guest who is able to join us. Toschia, can you hear us? Let's see, we'll see if we can get her connected, because when you're connected, you're protected. Toschia, can you hear us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We sure can. So what we're talking about, is something that I know you've done a lot of work around professionally and locally. It's around this topic of affirmative action. So, what does that look like in your perspective, and what guidance do you have for Black alumni leaders in this particular space?
I'm going to agree with both Chavis and more specifically with Paulette that we have to assume that affirmative action as we know it will no longer cease to exist. As an attorney, as a litigator, I think that one of the things that Black alumni can do collectively across a myriad of schools, private, HBCU, we have to stop waiting on other people to give us crumbs. I am of the Higginbotham old school, you do something wrong, meet me in the courtroom. But while we're in the courtroom fighting this out, I think it is beholden upon Black alumni from HBCUs, from PWIs, from our Divine Nine organizations to our social organizations, we need to be teaching our own children. And if we are blessed, and if we are honored to continue with affirmative action, fine. But I see too many of us sitting around waiting on other people to give us crumbs. And as Langston Hughes says, I too sing America. This is our country as well. And particularly, I believe that this is more our country because we built this country. But we can't sit around and lament and wonder, oh, what they're going to do. We already know. When in doubt, think worst case scenario. Take them to the courtroom. Like I said, as a lawyer, I am a Higginbotham. I will see you in the courtroom. However, we cannot put the blame on other people for what is going on in our communities. Teenage pregnancies, all-time high. I mean, if we can collectively organize and start doing some real community service, not just giving out coats to be cute so that we can stand up in church and say we did something, but we can start doing some in-your-face community service. We go to the hood. Let's talk to little Junebug. Hey, it's so much better for you to be Thurgood Marshall than to be LeBron James. And if we can inculcate ourselves, and if we can take off our own mask that shades and hides, and we understand this is where we're at. We have people that are running, that will be running for the presidency of the United States, that really want to set us back 50 or 60 years. Why are we sitting here waiting on the other foot to drop? So Black Elective, Black alumni, as well as social organizations. And another thing is, I think that Black alumni, we oftentimes get complacent with saying, oh, we got 5 Black people on this campus. But who are the Black people that are on that campus? They can put any Black face there. But if you're not doing any work, I agree that you may need to go home.
That's a mic drop moment. Ryan, how you feel? Can you pick it up?
I think we should leave it down there for a while. I think did a whole world. I mean, I think what I would encourage is we have a good sense of what the challenges are. I mean, Paulette articulated them, Chavis did, and Toschia did just now. Like the Supreme Court will no doubt eviscerate affirmative action as we know it. We know that the efforts, as in Florida and North Carolina, will continue to spread to erase us from the history books. And one challenge is, did we even know that history at all before it was erased? So I think we have a good sense of what the impending challenges are and will be. And the question for us, right, is what will we do and how will we enter the fight? So I guess what I would say, Allyson, and by the way, you've done a wonderful job moderating our panel, and I appreciate your work. I think one challenge for us is that the next time we read something and we're tempted to share it, yes, let's share it, but let's also share what our corresponding response to it will be. So we read, this thing is happening now. And then, so let's forward that, but then let's also say, and by the way, would you be willing to join me to do this thing in response to it? And whatever the thing we recommend we do is, let it be larger than the harm we're forwarding, right? So, because we forward to each other, even though we love each other, we forward harm after harm after harm, and it becomes overwhelming. What we don't do is take the time to think about, so I'm going to forward this harm that's coming to us or is upon us. What am I going to do in response? Let our response be bigger than the harm that we're forwarding. I think that's getting us to an affirmative strategy. And so to Chavis's point, you know, I'm on the board, as you all know, of my college. And in light of what's happening in the affirmative action space, we're preparing to think about, so we're nevertheless going to maintain our commitment to bringing racial diversity to the college, without regard to what the Supreme Court does. And that has to be, I think, the orientation of all of us as part of the Black Alumni Associations.
That's very, very insightful. And I'm not sure if anybody from Pitt is on the line, but the University of Pittsburgh, the Pitt African American Alumni Council, you know, they put words into action. And, you know, for all the leadership that's been happening there, you know, we grow and we learn from each other. So thank you, Ryan, for lifting that up. Now we've got a couple minutes left. And so where we want to end with is this. You know, if I can ask all my panelists to think of a call to action for Black alumni leaders and groups that are on the call today. Chavis, let's get started with you. Then let's move to Tamara, Paulette, Ryan, Toschia, and Marcus. So Chavis, kick us off.
I think this is a moment of, and a truly important moment where we have to come together around our collective imaginations and think critically about how we can lean on our history, as the conference focuses on this theme of Sankofa, lean on our history to find nuggets that can help us in the present. And I mentioned the freedom schools earlier. We can no longer wait for others to do that which for us we can do for ourselves. We have to really think critically and come up with programs to ensure that our students are being educated, get with the law school professors at your respective institutions or in your alumni associations, and think about how we can come up with different recruiting tactics to ensure diverse campuses, and just make sure that we're being head licensed at a tail license. Don't wait until the negative situation happens, but get ahead of it, stay abreast of the news, and ensure that these campuses and these communities are as diverse and inclusive as they can be.
Thank you, Chavis. Dr. Butler.
For me, it'll probably be a combination of thinking about programming. I also believe that we can't keep reinventing the wheel. So I'm pretty sure that there's probably some organizations in your community that are trying to do those things or are doing those things, and we probably just need to put our energy into really boosting those and really feeding, you know, putting money into those organizations and institutions. And so for us, I think about grassroots organizations, faith-based organizations, after-school programs, just lending our time and talent to those, or at least getting them to work together, which has been my new strategy of being like, let's just work together so that we can stop splitting hairs. So I think as alumni, if you're at the nexus of multiple organizations, would it be possible for you to try to pull those organizations together to get us to share our resources in an effective manner? And in doing so, also giving people the literature and the information they need so they can decide where they're going to pick up the fight. I think what we're up against in terms of anti-Blackness is a hydra. So you cut one head off and two more grow back. And so for me, if we're going to do that, people need as much information and support as they can get. So those are mine.
All right, Dr. Butler, we understand the assignment. Paulette, let's hear from you, then Ryan, then Toschia, then we'll close with Marcus.
And so I will be very brief because I completely agree with Chavis and Tamara, and know that I will agree with Ryan and Marcus as well. And Tanisha, if she speaks, but my thing is that we have to anticipate what's going to happen next. And as we do what Tamara and Chavis said for us to do, I think that we can't be concerned with who is going to get the credit for doing it. You know, that's what happens with a lot of our organizations. We jockey. who's going to get the credit for doing this thing? And so then we could get so consumed sometimes with who's going to get the credit, we can't move. And so I think that we need to be able to step back and say, this is a joint effort and that it doesn't matter who gets the credit. We have one goal in mind, and that is to move the Black community forward.
All right, thank you so much, Paulette. Let's see, I think we have Marcus. Marcus, are you still with us? If not, we're gonna
Yeah,
pivot.
I'm
All right.
still, yeah. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I just want to answer one question as Q&A and just like give my action item because it's kind of baked in. A lot of the BLM chapters have been boots on the ground as far as attending some of these school board meetings. There's a question about some of the Black superintendents that have been removed and some of the attacks on public education. I'd say organize on the local level. A lot of these school board stuff goes under the radar. They usually have textbook reviews and things of that nature. So I'd say organize, again, what Dr. Butler said, like if there's organizations that do similar work and are both, sending these messages to each other, like what's going on, like let's organize and let's have a meeting. I think sometimes that might be the best way to at least start the conversation, like bring these people who you're getting these same messages from, let's hop on a call and like, okay, how are we gonna pull up to this city council meeting or this, we had a school board meeting. The last two, actually, we pulled up at least like 50 to 60 public comments each time. And we actually ended up flipping two folks who we thought were going to vote the same way every time. So it doesn't always happen like that, but that public pressure and just like having a presence is really important. So that's my
Community
advice.
organizing helps turn states in a different way. We saw it in Georgia. We need to see it happen across the country. Ryan, let's hear from you, and then we'll close with Toschia.
Yeah, no, I'll make it brief. I love Marcus's point because I do think we have seen the rise of the attempts to erase us from the history books, but there's also been a corresponding effort to have a conversation about reparations. And it's alive in a way now across the country, particularly in local communities, that we probably haven't seen ever, right? And it doesn't get a lot of attention because of what it's pushing, but it is inspiring to see that communities are already doing a lot of what we're talking about here. And then the question is, how do we as Black alumni and Black alumni associations support work that's already ongoing to advance it further?
Thank you, Ryan. Toschia, let's hear from you.
Can you hear me, Allyson?
Yes, we can.
Okay, one thing, I agree with everything that everyone said. I think that we need to organize, strategize, and unify. It doesn't matter who gets the credit. Most of us on this call, we've attended many different schools, small schools, big schools, large schools, and I think we need to reach out to all of those schools that we attended and start getting people in the fold. For example, with the incident that happened at Michigan State, we, as Coker Black alumni, we just reached out to them. We sent them flowers. We sent them two sets of flowers, one on behalf of the Black Alumni Collective, one on behalf of Coker Black Alumni. And so one of the young ladies from the Michigan State, the Atlanta chapter said, oh, I've never heard of the Black Alumni Collective. And she said, who do I reach out to? So I said, Allyson Reaves, but you may not want to talk to her until after March 11th or 12th. That would be a good time to reach out to her. So I think that as we organize, we need to understand that we are the W.E.B. Du Boisian talented 10th. Just on this phone call right now, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, we see the brilliance of Blackness, Black excellence. We have doctors, we have lawyers, we have professors, we have statisticians. We have to utilize our individual strengths as the Avengers. Spider-Man does not have the same talent that Captain America does, but when they all came together to get rid of Thanos, it worked. And that's what we have to understand, that white supremacy is our Thanos. And someone needs to have that spider web, someone else needs to be Hulk, but we have got to eradicate this. We stand on the shoulders of too many people that have died, that have been killed, that have been maimed, that have been psychologically abused for us to have the freedoms. And if we are complacent and we're comfortable, shame on us. We have got to have this attitude. If my child is okay, I want every Black child to be okay. So for me, I think the call to action would be to go to state capitals. We need to have Black alumni going to each state capital and not just going for a photo op. We need to be getting down the names of who's who on this education committee, and we need to be taking names, and we need to have collective accountability, not only amongst ourselves, but also amongst those elected officials that are supposed to be supporting us, that are supposed to be taking care of our communities, when in fact they do not.
All right, y'all done dropped the mic. I can't do anything else except bring us to a close. Thank you so much, Chavis, Dr. Butler, Paulette, Ryan, Marcus, and Toschia for engaging us in this critical conversation that we got to be having in every state around the country and in fact, the world. So with that, we're going to draw to a close. I think, Kanisha, if you can hear us, we're going to move right into our next session. If you all need to take a break, for folks who are dialed in, please feel free to go ahead and take your break. But we are going to move into our next session. Kanisha, I think, is going to come on and introduce it. Hey, Kanisha.